Valentin Sokolov, the legendary poet of the GULAG, remembered by Konstantin Kovalyov. Translated from the Russian by Alissa Ordabai, including all poems and verses. Russian prisoner poet Valentin Petrovich Sokolov, 1927 to 1982, and I have been sharing living quarters in the same labor camp barrack from May 1963 to February 1965. We were friends and he was my instructor in the art of poetry. The camp was called the Seven, i.e. labor camp number 7 of Dubrovlag in Mordovia. When I first came to this camp for political prisoners, or as we were called, particularly dangerous offenders against the state, Valentin had already served a total of 14 years, first a 9-year term, then a 5-year term. As for me, having served 6 months in prison, I had 2 more years left until my release. But Valentin would have to suffer another 16 years of prisons, camps, and, which is even worse, psychiatric hospitals, right up to the hour of his death. Like most of the prisoners who had the experience of Stalin's labor camps, Valentin Sokolov adhered strictly to unwritten rules and customs among prisoners. In the past, this kind of behavior was, among other things, a way to survive. For Valentin, however, it was primarily a way to remain pure, strong, luminous, young, and not to fall face down in the mud at the feet of the iron-faced idol. Therefore, he had no liaisons with the camp authorities and no liaisons with inmates who violated the prisoner's code of honor. For his wish to remain pure and strong, the iron-faced idol of totalitarianism trampled on Valentin with its giant feet. But the idol only managed to make the poet's outer appearance look rugged, made him look like an experienced camp inmate, like a roughneck worker. Therefore, when I first met Sokolov, looking at him for the first time, I not only failed to recognize his poetic personality, but did not even recognize an intellectual in him. I remember how on the very first Sunday after my arrival in the camp, I was sitting on an upper bunk looking around me with caution, despite the fact that no one was trying to threaten me. But I was simply being aware of the types of people around me. After all, only yesterday I had been a member of the Komsomol, the Young Communists' League, and bore the title of a highly productive contributor to communist labor. And now I was surrounded by people I knew about only from books and newspapers, Soviets who served as German police goons and who fought under German command during World War II, Forest Brother resistance fighters from the Baltic states, and simply people, some of whom were the same age as me, who for reasons unknown to me hated communism. Not every evil regime would have imprisoned such a devotee of its system as I had been. To do that, it would also have to be a stupid regime, like ours. It punished me for the fact that in spite of all my ideological loyalty, I also possessed humanity. I dared to protest against the shooting of a workers' demonstration in Novocherkassk in 1962. Or maybe the regime got it right in its own way. After all, it viewed kind-heartedness and independent thinking as the most serious of all crimes. And so, sitting on my bunk, I suddenly heard a furious altercation by the entryway. From there, 2 prisoners entered the barrack, continuing to argue loudly. One of them, a puny young man wearing glasses and whose political convictions, as I understood, could be described as pink, that is, a social democrat, was telling his opponent that socialism could be good, with a human face. His opponent, in a burnt quilted workman jacket, with a rough weathered face and chipped but strong teeth, defended capitalism. And not just any old type of capitalism, but American capitalism. "Do you know what a worker needs?" the prisoner was shouting hoarsely, almost crouching down, as if getting ready for a mighty jump. "He needs a refrigerator in his house and meat inside that refrigerator. And an American worker has all of that. That's why he works so well. Puts his back into it." The speaker, or rather the screamer, even slightly choked on his saliva. He had not tasted any meat for 5 years, as I later found out. And unable to argue further, he bent his elbow and depicted something indecent right under the nose of the man in spectacles. At this point, I could not resist interfering, and addressing the roughneck with the word comrade, tried, like a former university student should, to tell him about the delights of Lenin's socialism. The convict, with his large head, like a lion, swung his body in my direction as if wanting to tear into me, but seeing a naive newbie sitting in front of him, said nothing, and even cooled down somewhat. A few days later, I met a chap, a camp intellectual, an aesthete, now a writer, whose name I do not give here because he had asked me not to. I began to recite my poetry to him, expecting praise. However, the aesthete said to me, "All this sounds like Isakovsky," adding that I did possess some degree of talent and would perhaps benefit from being introduced to the genius camp poet Valentin Sokolov, or Valyok Sokolov as he was known, and he immediately began to recite Valentin's poems to show me how masterful they were. At that time, I had no idea that poetry, besides rhyme and meter, also could have consonances, and that sounds and feelings and different concepts could be colored in different colors, and that lines could be left hanging without rhymes, like unfinished chords, and, most importantly, that, as it turned out, to start out with an idea and then to proceed giving it a verbal shape was not the way to do it. One should start with a form, with a sound, with each consonant and with each vowel, with a rhyme and with a consonance, and then proceed toward an idea and toward a certain feeling. This may sound absurd, and many would disagree with this way of doing things, but poetry did emerge that way, and astounding poetry at that. No wonder it is said, "In the beginning there was the word." The word, not an idea. Meanwhile, the aesthete recited, "Nights akin to black holes put a spring in my step, and the night nestles tight, silent pathways it swept. The black flesh of the night snuggles up to each roof. The night must have grown tired, sweetly sleeping, unmoved." He drew my attention to the fact that Sokolov doesn't tell, he shows, draws, like an illustrator or even like a draftsman, using words instead of brushes or pencils. The drumbeat throbs along the tangent lines. The night bedecks its screen with exclamation signs. From head to toe, in question marks, a man now runs along, an invitation in his hand to where he doesn't belong. Or this, where the line proceeds straight forward, there is wind, and me, and wardens. Where the line is running bent, there is you, in speckled dress. According to my new acquaintance, color in Sokolov's poetry was not about assigning colors to different objects, but a designation of their essence. Symbolic, of course. So blue stood for death, black stood for something secret and forbidden. Naturally, Sokolov was finding colors, sounds, and everything else rather unconsciously, which is characteristic of real artists, and wasn't inventing anything as a result of a conscious mental effort. But the images and metaphors of Valentin Sokolov are phenomenally striking. The aesthete, in his camp quilted jacket, told me that Valentin was married to a woman 10 years older than him, and this is how he wrote about her. "Next to these white hair strands, next to flaxen hair, my quiet hour almost past, worldly joy without care. But something also from above, in the way you drove your speech, barely audible for both. Speech. Speech was quiet, and its message ran across the night. Any nudity took flight. On a very quiet note, we commune with altitude." "Imagine," exclaimed the aesthete, and his glasses flashed, "he composed such prayerful hymn about a simple working woman of about 40. I saw her in the house for visits when my mother was visiting me. It so happened that Valyok had a visit from his wife on the same date. Do you know what he means when he speaks of white hair strands, flaxen hair? She has white hair. He doesn't mean blonde hair. He means white hair. She already has a lot of white hair. And he sees her the way Don Quixote saw Dulcinea. The aesthete drew my attention to the fact that Sokolov, as a modernist, he compared him to Lorca, emphasizing, however, that Valentin was not familiar with Lorca's poetry until 1963, barely uses punctuation marks, and that he positions his lines in zigzags, not in columns, putting one line more to the left and the alternating line to the right, depending on its emotional bearing. Now I need to say this. Of all the poems that I am citing here, only those are given the zigzag positioning which I have copied from notebooks where Sokolov wrote himself and which he gave to me. Other poems, which I have recorded under the dictation of various inmates, I had to write down in columns because I did not know how the author himself meant for the lines to be positioned. And when the aesthete began to recite excerpts from Sokolov's poem Grotesques to me, I was thunderstruck. Until then, I believed that the age of great Russian poets remained in the past. Pushkin, Lermontov, Yesenin, and that now, as they say, what we have are poets who at best can be described as famous. And suddenly here, in our camp, such talent. I asked in which barrack this Sokolov person lived. It turned out that he lived in the same barrack as me. I began to mentally sift through the faces of the inhabitants of our barrack, but I could not stop at any one person. There was simply no such sublime poetic personality there. The aesthete refused to introduce me to Sokolov, saying that Sokolov was not too inclined to make new acquaintances, and therefore I should try to get to know him myself. But he promised to point out Valentin to me from afar so that I would know whom I needed to speak to. And on that same day he pointed out Sokolov to me. At first I thought a joke was being played on me. When a large figure, slowly moving from the stinking dining room toward the barrack, approached, I was dumbfounded. It was that same rude prisoner with a burnt sleeve, who spoke in prison jargon and regularly drank chifer, especially strong tea, in a rather dubious, as it seemed to me at first, company. Nevertheless, a couple of days later, I approached Valentin, or Valyok as everyone called him, and timidly addressed him as Valentin Petrovich, said that I was an admirer of his talent and was asking him to give his opinion about my poetry. By the way, I got my prison term for writing poems. Contrary to what the aesthete had said about Sokolov's reticence, he willingly agreed and went with me to the window. After listening to me reciting my poems, he stopped me and said that I read too well, and this made my poems seem better than they actually were. He took my notebook from my hands and began to read. My poems were rather inept, since I did not know any real poetry of the 20th century, neither Svetaeva nor Voloshin. I haven't even heard their names. I only heard about Pasternak, and I haven't read all of Yesenin's works, so examples that I followed, indeed, were different kinds of Isakovskys. But unlike most poets, Valentin Sokolov was not in the habit of destroying other people's poetry. He praised some of my poems, advised me to rewrite some others, and then gradually moved to expressing his views on poetry in general, and began to reveal the secrets of poetic mastery. I realized that he was not simply a natural talent, but also a person who deeply understood what he was doing. Valentin was saying that imagery should not come from the head, and that he, for example, attunes himself to a stream of consciousness, and, as it were, catches sounds, rhymes, and images from this stream without straining himself with constant analysis, such as, is it appropriate to say this? Doesn't this contradict generally accepted notions? But the main thing that Valentin drew my attention to was the utmost brevity, vividness, and depth of poetic information. One should not tell, but show, or even more correctly, depict. And depict not as a leisurely painter, but as a graphic artist who omits everything inessential, leaving white, unpainted areas on paper, using sharp, expressive strokes, applying contrasting colors from a limited palette, black, red, blue, lilac, green, grey. But grey is to be used most often, the way a graphic artist would use a simple lead pencil. Each color is a designation of the essence of an object or a phenomenon. Valentin said that in the 20th century, information hits a person like a hammer across the head, and that people have no time to delve into lengths and details. Therefore, a person can only be affected by lines which are fast and bright, like a flash of lightning. Wanting to illustrate this point, Valentin, to my delight, began to recite his own poems. He recited them not in his usual broken, hoarse voice, but softly, with the sound coming from his chest, like a secret sigh of a hunted soul. I am carved into something rough, me and iron and lips. I steer along some kind of black frontier into a tear, moved by some kind of back voice that I hear. He was reciting poem after poem, and I noticed that his earlier works, for all their imagery, had more specificity, depicting what one can see with one's eyes, and his later poems might seem incomprehensible at first reading, since they do not depict a specific reality, but rather the inner world of the poet who was passing through the circles of hell, the kind of hell which is fenced off with barbed wire. The only reality is the one which remains unknown. Indeed, he does not waste time writing hundreds of ponderous lines, like in prose, about who he is, how old he is, why he became imprisoned, what he looks like, etc., etc. He only conveys his feeling of unfreedom, the degree of which he describes as closely as possible to the feeling of death. With his lips, and not only with his lips, but also with his very soul, the poet is plunged into the iron of the regime, into the handcuffs, into the prison bars, into the barbed wire. There is no joy in such existence. As a recent Komsomol member, I was surprised to learn that some of Valentin's verses mentioned God. He calmly explained that he was an Orthodox Christian and that he believed in God. Brought up in the spirit of the only correct teaching, for a long time I could not understand how such a wise poet could, like some kind of grandmother, have religious prejudices. His political views were also alien to me, for he was a supporter of the capitalist system, and at the time I believed in the possibility of good socialism. However, in this particular case, I was indifferent to what Sokolov's views were, for talent was what I saw in him above all. He recited his poems, and I was carefully examining his face. His features were beautiful, large. The outer corners of his slightly squinty eyes were positioned lower than the inner corners. Despite the lack of formal similarity, this face as a whole somehow reminded me of Shaliapin's face. He was a mighty Russian man of tremendous inner strength and tenderness, not an intellectual and not a peasant, but everything that the Russian nation contains, with its wisdom, its daring, its anarchic revolt, and sincerity, which cannot be compared with Western sentimentality, for example of the German kind. Valentin's face was covered with premature wrinkles and small bluish dots here and there. Only now, as I am writing this, it suddenly dawns on me that those were traces of coal dust embedded in the miner's face. By the way, regarding his profession, although Valentin worked as a slave miner during his first term, and then, after his release, in the town of Novoshakhtinsk, he was, of course, a professional poet. I am saying this in response to the fact that some Novoshakhtinsk newspapers, in their recent benevolent publications about Valentin Sokolov, use some incorrect phrases such as Valentin Sokolov was not a professional poet, or that he sometimes had rough, inaccurate rhymes. To make things clear, Sokolov did not have inaccurate rhymes. He deliberately used unusual rhymes or replaced them with consonances that may sound as bad rhymes to the uninformed, and the roughness of his language is an attempt, as for example in Mayakovsky's poetry, to go beyond the generally accepted book language in order to express the inexpressible. Of course, if you recognize as a professional poet someone who, say, belongs to the Rostov Writers' Organization, or the Moscow Writers' Organization, etc., someone who receives grocery supplies, who receives vouchers to spend time at boarding houses for creatives in the Crimea, someone who eats salmon at the Central House of Writers and writes about our bright future. Then, of course, Valentin was not such a professional. We became friends. Once, I asked him to tell me something about his biography. He became wary. What for? I replied bluntly that I considered him an outstanding poet, and that my prison term was about to expire, and that I would try to bring out into the free world not only some of Valentin's poems, but also biographical information about him. Who knows which one of us will outlive whom, but it would be bad if, apart from his surname, no one would know anything about him. Valentin agreed with unexpected ease. He turned out to be an extraordinary storyteller. If he were not a poet and were he not our contemporary, he could have become an excellent comic actor. He would change his voice amazingly, portraying different characters, or, as he would call them, types. In general, he liked to call unpleasant people types. When portraying women, Sokolov would endow them with squeaky, silly voices, although his attitude to women was kind, akin to an attitude towards unadvised children. Bosses, that is, investigators, judges, and military officials, were being portrayed by him as peculiar kinds of subjects with round eyes and square mouths. And in general, during his narration, his face would completely turn into the face of the person he was talking about at that moment. So Valentin told me that in 1946 he was enlisted into the army in the Moscow military district. There, he became friends with two soldiers who, like him, wrote poetry. Valentin began to write poetry as a schoolboy, and he graduated from the 10th grade of school in his hometown of Likoslavel, Tver region. 3 young poets in private's uniforms were noticed by their superiors. From my own experience, I know that the authorities are most afraid not of simply seditious persons, but of seditious poets, rightly believing that a poetic word has a greater impact than prose. Therefore, law enforcement is more prone to arresting poets ahead of arresting anyone else. To cut a long story short, when this trinity began to write poems about the mustachioed man, they got arrested, and the military tribunal of the Moscow garrison gave them 10 each, and off they went to Taishet. What awaited them there? For the sake of brevity, I will answer this question with the lines of the poet himself, written in 1959. By the guard post, freezing corpses, in the mess hall in his portion, hungry eye hunts after morsels, and a man, enormous, gross, tormented by grieving thoughts, suddenly becomes half corpse. Someone threw a smoke away. Instantly 3 men are fighting, and the 4th, amidst this daze, pours his blade in, like a lightning. Space restrictions do not allow me to quote further, but is this not at the same level as One Day in Ivan Denisovich or The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, only in verse? And most importantly, Sokolov wrote this before Alexander Isayevich, after having been released into, as Valiok used to say, the big camp. He saw that nothing wonderful was awaiting him. But the year was 1957. Valentin was amnestied a year before the end of his term, at the time when many, including myself, I was 21 at the time, demobilized from the army, felt overjoyed for no particular reason. But casting aside our illusory political enchantments and seeing our society for what it was, Valentin himself fell into romantic illusions when it came to his love life. He fell in love with a simple working woman 10 years older than him and saw in her a beautiful young heroine. Only occasionally would he realize that much was not the way he had imagined it, and this tormented him. Now I know. It's crucifixion, this horrendous call of bedsheets. Sprawled incision, your eyes gazing with attrition, toppled over as crucifixion, your dedition. Now I know this nervous shout. Isn't passion a tawdry gallop of a mare, racing through eyelashes where faces are thrown back a flare, wishing to bite in with flair, wishing greedily to echo in the body of the night, wishing, 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 wishing for the night. It is difficult to find in the entire world literature such an almost concrete and at the same time pure depiction of intimacy between a man and a woman. Some authors get away with modest ellipses, others slide towards pornography. Valentin read his poem Grotesques to me a day later, by heart, and now he was recounting his Odyssey in prose. At the same time, he was clearly embarrassed to talk about his wife as sublimely as he did in his poetry, and therefore he rudely belittled her image. By the way, we observe the same phenomenon in Pushkin's relationship with his beloved women. In poetry, as in a special sphere of being, he speaks of a fleeting vision, or of the purest charm, the purest image, and in his letters to Anna Kern or to Natalia Nikolaevna, he assumes a certain gaucherie, as if ashamed of his love. Valentin knew how to talk comically about tragic things, in a way that would have probably made Zoshenko envious. By doing this, Valentin, it seems to me, was subduing his pain. Here's how he told about his second arrest and trial, which have followed approximately a year later, or even less, after he'd been amnestied while serving his first term. I settled in Novoshakhtinsk. They gave me a residence permit to live there. I got married. My wife, Ksenia, whom I have called affectionately the grandmother, took care of me. Even now she comes to visit me. She had a daughter, an 11-year-old pioneer, so I got on with work, wasn't bothering anyone, and suddenly I'm being arrested again. The location of my pre-trial detention was Rostov. Just like in your case, dear. Valentin had taken to calling me dear, KK. The investigation was being conducted there, and they took me to court. And in court I saw not only my lawyer, but also the prosecutor, and assessors, and the judge. All broads. Immediately I realized that they would give me the maximum term possible according to the 10th section of Statute 58. The judge, of course, hadn't read my case file, she'd been too lazy to. So she was shuffling through the file, saying in a sing-song voice, "So, Sokolov had been tried in court before and obviously doesn't have a job." "What do you mean he doesn't have a job?" My lawyer jumps up. "Citizen judge, there is a letter of verification from his place of work." "Oh, yes, I see," replies the judge. "He does indeed work, but obviously is a poor worker, and he mostly drinks and indulges in debauchery." "Citizen judge," flies up my lawyer again, "what do you mean, indulges in debauchery, when he is married? Here is his wife right there. She is a witness in this case." "Oh, yes, he is married," nods the judge. "That's right, which means he indulges in debauchery with his wife." At this point, my grandmother couldn't keep silent any longer. She, before going to this hearing, drank a bit of Dutch courage, so she got up and squeaked at the judge, "Are you, bitch, by any chance jealous?" The judge choked and red and white blots swept her face. Finally she screamed, "What have you just said, citizen witness?" And my grandmother replied calmly, "Nothing, citizen judge. You must have misheard me." "Oh, I must have misheard you," said the judge. "Well then, you may remain in the room." Then my wife's daughter was called. She was also a witness, wearing a white top, black bottom, and a red tie, burning red. The judge asked her, "Witness, tell the court what statements the defendant had been making to his family." And my wife's daughter, with cheeks flushed red to match the color of her tie, sang, as if she was at Pioneers' gathering, "He scolded Stalin and even scolded Lenin." So my grandmother squeaked from her place again, "Zenya, you pest, shut up!" The judge gasped again. "What have you just said, citizen witness?" "I haven't said anything," replied my grandmother. "You, citizen judge, must have misheard me." "Oh, I must have misheard you," said the stunned judge. "Well then, you may remain in the room." To cut the long story short, my grandmother wound up the judges so bad they gave me a 10-year sentence. And Valyok, as if having in his mind's eye admired the verbal picture of this court hearing he had just painted, laughed with a short and sharp laughter. What followed were prisoner transportation transits and labour camp, this time in Mordovia, where I have met V. Sokolov for the first time. By that time, in 1963, he had managed to go through 5 years of his second 10-year sentence. Did we know that the fate would consider the 19 years he had already spent in labour camps too little, and that he would spend another 3 terms in camps side by side with criminals and would end his path in a mental asylum? In total, 30 years of captivity from his youth until his very death.